The Kingdom of Georgia in 1220 was a jewel of Christian civilization in the Caucasus. Wealthy beyond measure, protected by mountain fortresses, and ruled by the legendary Queen Tamar's successors, Georgia seemed untouchable. Its knights had crushed Muslim armies for generations. Its churches glittered with gold. Its people believed God himself guarded their mountain kingdom. Then the Mongols arrived, and in less than 3 years, Georgia was drowning in blood. What happened next was not just a military defeat, it was a systematic extermination that would make Georgia a graveyard. The Mongols didn't just conquer Georgia, they erased entire cities from existence. They turned fertile valleys into bone fields. They transformed one of the medieval world's most powerful Christian kingdoms into a tributary state, so terrified of its masters that Georgian nobles would crawl on their bellies before Mongol commanders for the next century. This is the story of how a Mongol force that never exceeded 20,000 warriors annihilated a kingdom of over 1 million people. How they turned Georgian military might into a sick joke. How they discovered that mountain fortresses meant nothing when you were willing to kill everyone inside. And how they taught the Christian world a lesson it would never forget, that there were worse things than Muslim invasions, much worse. To understand the horror of what happened, you need to understand what Georgia was before the Mongols came. This wasn't some backwater principality. Under Queen Tamar, who ruled from 1184 to 1213, Georgia had become a regional superpower. Her armies had crushed the Seljuk Turks repeatedly. Her territory stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian. Her court was so magnificent that Persian poets traveled hundreds of miles to sing her praises. Georgian warriors were no joke. They fought in the same heavy cavalry tradition as European knights, full armor, lances, trained from childhood. Their mountain fortresses were considered impregnable. Natural choke points in the Caucasus meant any invading army would have to funnel through narrow passes where Georgian defenders could slaughter them by the hundreds. The Georgians had faced steppe nomads before, Turkic raiders, Cuman horse archers, various Muslim warbands. Every time, the mountains had protected them. Every time, Georgian steel and Georgian fortresses had prevailed. The kingdom's military elite genuinely believed they were untouchable. They had no idea what was coming. By 1220, Queen Tamar was dead, and her son Georgi IV Lasha ruled Georgia. The kingdom was still powerful, still wealthy, still confident. When reports started filtering in about mysterious horsemen who had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire to the east, the Georgian court paid attention but wasn't particularly worried. Nomads were nomads. Let them try to invade the Caucasus. The mountains would swallow them whole. This assumption would cost Georgia everything. The Mongol force that invaded Georgia in 1220 was a reconnaissance expedition, not even a proper invasion army. Led by generals Jebe and Subutai, two of the most brilliant military minds in history, this force of roughly 20,000 horsemen had been given a simple mission by Genghis Khan: circle around the Caspian Sea, probe the kingdoms to the west, and report back what you find. What they found was Georgia, and they decided to break it. Understand something about Mongol military doctrine. These weren't wild barbarians charging randomly into battle. Mongol armies operated with a level of tactical sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. They used coordinated movements across hundreds of miles. They employed sophisticated reconnaissance networks. They understood logistics better than any medieval army. And they had a policy toward resistance that was brutally simple. Submit immediately, and you might live. Resist, and we will kill everyone. Everyone. The Georgians chose to resist. They looked at this force of 20,000 horsemen and saw an opportunity for glory. Georgian armies had beaten steppe warriors before. King Georgi IV personally led a massive force. Estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 men to drive these invaders out. The Battle of Kunan would teach Georgia its first terrible lesson about what Mongols actually were. In early 1221, the Georgian army caught up with the Mongol force in the mountains. The Georgians were confident. They had superior numbers. They had heavily armored knights. They had God on their side. They charged forward expecting a glorious victory. What happened instead was a masterclass in Mongol warfare. The Mongol vanguard appeared to panic when they saw the Georgian host. They turned and fled. The Georgian knights, smelling blood, spurred their horses forward in pursuit, deeper into the valleys, further from their infantry support, stringing out their formation as faster riders pulled ahead of slower ones. This was exactly what the Mongols wanted. The feigned retreat was the oldest trick in the steppe warfare playbook, but European and Middle Eastern armies fell for it every single time. The reason was simple. Heavily armored cavalry couldn't resist the temptation to catch what looked like fleeing light horsemen. It went against every instinct of knightly warfare to let the enemy escape. When the Georgian cavalry was sufficiently disordered and exhausted, the Mongols turned, and the real killing began. Mongol horse archers could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. They could fire 10 arrows in the time it took a Georgian knight to ready one lance thrust. Their composite bows could punch through chainmail at close range, and they didn't fight like European knights. They swarmed, surrounded, and shot from every direction simultaneously. The Georgian knights suddenly found themselves in a nightmare. Arrows came from all sides. When they turned to face one group of Mongols, another group appeared behind them. Their heavy armor, which protected them from sword strikes, meant nothing against the arrow storm. Horses went down screaming. Knights crashed to the ground in full armor and were ridden down by Mongol cavalry. Those who tried to retreat found their path blocked by fresh Mongol units. Jebe and Subutai had planned this perfectly. The Georgians weren't in a battle. They were in a killing pen. The slaughter at Khunan was total. Estimates of Georgian losses range from 10,000 to 30,000 dead, virtually the entire cavalry force that had pursued the Mongols. King George IV himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield with a handful of survivors. But here's where the Mongol invasion became something more than just a military defeat. Here's where it became genocide. The Mongols didn't just kill enemy soldiers, they pursued the Georgian retreat systematically, hunting down survivors. They swept through the surrounding valleys, killing every Georgian they found. Soldiers, refugees, peasants, it didn't matter. They burned villages, they slaughtered livestock, they poisoned wells. Contemporary Georgian chronicles describe scenes that sound like the end of the world. Bodies piled in the snow. Entire villages where every single person had been killed. Monasteries filled with monks who had been butchered at their altars. Women and children who had fled into the mountains only to be hunted down by Mongol scouts. The Mongols had a system for this. After battles, they would divide into smaller units and systematically sweep through the surrounding countryside. They would gather all prisoners in central locations. Then they would execute them. Not in quick massacres, but in organized kills that could take days. Some prisoners were forced to kill each other. Some were used for archery practice. Some were simply beheaded in assembly line fashion. The Georgians called it the time of darkness. They believed the devil himself had sent these horsemen. After Khunan, Jebe and Subutai spent 1221 systematically raiding Georgia. This wasn't a conquest yet. It was reconnaissance by fire. They wanted to test Georgian defenses, identify weak points, and teach the kingdom what happened to those who resisted. They attacked Tbilisi, Georgia's capital, but didn't besiege it seriously. They raided into Armenia. They destroyed several fortified towns, demonstrating that Georgian fortifications weren't as impregnable as everyone believed. When defenders refused to surrender, the Mongols would take the fortress anyway, through escalade, undermining, or simply starving everyone out, and then kill every single person inside. Men, women, children, elderly, priests, everyone. This policy wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated terror. The Mongols wanted word to spread about what happened to those who resisted. They wanted the next fortress to surrender immediately rather than face extermination. It worked. By late 1221, Georgian resistance was crumbling. The kingdom had lost its best troops at Khunan. Its fortresses were falling. Its people were traumatized. King Georgi IV was forced to sue for peace and pay tribute. Jebe and Subutai accepted. They continued their reconnaissance mission, swinging north to crush the Cumans and eventually fight the Russians at the Kalka River. But Georgia had been marked. The Mongols now knew exactly how weak it was. They would return to finish the job. The Mongols came back to Georgia in 1236 as part of their larger invasion of Eastern Europe. This time, they didn't come as a reconnaissance force. They came as conquerors. The Georgian kingdom had not recovered from the first invasion. The defeat at Kunan had broken something in the Georgian military psyche. The nobility was divided. The army was a shadow of its former strength. And everyone remembered what the Mongols had done last time. When Mongol armies under generals Chormagan and Munka swept into Georgia in 1236, resistance collapsed almost immediately. Some fortresses held out briefly. Some Georgian nobles tried to fight, but most simply surrendered and hoped for mercy. They received none. The Mongols spent the next several years systematically destroying Georgian power. They besieged and captured fortress after fortress. Each time, they implemented the same policy. If you surrendered before the siege began, you might be spared. If you forced them to besiege you, everyone died. The Georgian Chronicle describes cities where the population was executed en masse after capture. Defenders were tied together and drowned in rivers. Nobles were tortured to reveal the locations of hidden treasures, then killed anyway. Priests were burned alive in their churches. One account describes Mongol soldiers going house to house in a captured city, dragging everyone outside and organizing them in groups. Men, women, children, elderly, all separated into different groups. Then the killing began systematically. The men first, beheaded in batches, then the women, then the children, then the elderly. The Mongols wanted to make sure no one survived to cause trouble later. One fortress deserves special mention, Kurt-Visi. This supposedly impregnable fortress, built on a rocky outcrop at the confluence of two rivers, held out against multiple Mongol assaults. The defenders knew what would happen if they surrendered. They chose to fight. The Mongols besieged Kurt-Visi for months. They tried direct assault. They tried undermining the walls. They tried starving out the defenders. Nothing worked. The fortress had its own water supply and years of stored food. Its walls were built on sheer cliffs. The Georgian defenders shot down every Mongol who approached. So the Mongols changed tactics. They built siege engines, trebuchets and mangonels, and began bombarding the fortress day and night. They diverted rivers to undermine the foundations. They captured nearby villages and drove the populations toward the fortress walls, forcing the defenders to watch civilians being slaughtered below. Kurt-Visi held for over a year. Finally, in 1238, the walls cracked. The Mongols poured in. What happened next was deliberate. The Mongols didn't just kill the defenders quickly, they made examples. The garrison commander was reportedly crucified on the fortress walls. Other defenders were flayed alive. Some were tied to catapults and thrown off the cliffs. The torture lasted for days, with surviving defenders forced to watch before their turn came. The message was clear. This is what happens when you resist for too long. By 1240, Georgia was thoroughly conquered. But the Mongols didn't just want military victory, they wanted absolute submission. They implemented a system designed to break Georgian society permanently. Georgian nobles were forced to appear at Mongol courts regularly, not just in Georgia, but in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, thousands of miles away. This wasn't diplomacy, it was humiliation. Georgian princes would prostrate themselves before Mongol officials, literally crawling on their bellies to demonstrate submission. Those who showed insufficient respect were executed on the spot. Georgia was divided into different administrative regions, each controlled by Mongol officials. Georgian troops were conscripted into Mongol armies and sent to fight in China, in Persia, in Russia, anywhere except Georgia. This served two purposes. It reduced the military strength remaining in Georgia, and it sent a message that Georgian soldiers now belonged to the Mongol Empire. The tribute demanded was crushing. Gold, silver, livestock, grain, manufactured goods and slaves. Mongol census takers moved through Georgia counting every household, every animal, every resource. Anyone who couldn't pay tribute was enslaved. Villages that couldn't meet their quotas were burned. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the system of hostages. Georgian nobles were required to send their children to Mongol courts as hostages for good behavior. These children were raised as Mongols, taught Mongol language and customs, and often never returned home. It was a deliberate policy to destroy Georgian identity from within. The Mongol conquest of Georgia wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a slow genocide that lasted decades. The population collapse was staggering. Estimates suggest Georgia's population dropped from over 1 million before the Mongol invasions to perhaps 300,000 by 1250. This wasn't just from direct killing, though plenty of that happened. It was from the systematic destruction of Georgian society. Farmland was abandoned, trade networks collapsed, cities emptied, survivors fled to the mountains or tried to escape to neighboring kingdoms. Disease followed the Mongol armies. Bubonic plague, typhus and other epidemics ravaged populations already weakened by warfare and famine. The Mongols didn't care. They continued demanding tribute from communities that barely existed anymore. Georgian culture survived, but in a haunted form. Churches were rebuilt, but on a smaller scale. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, but monks wrote in margins about the time of horrors when the Mongols came. Georgian epic poetry from this period is obsessed with death, loss, and the fragility of civilization. The psychological trauma lasted for generations. Georgian nobles who served Mongol overlords were caught in an impossible position. They had to collaborate to save anything of their society, but collaboration meant participating in the oppression of their own people. Some Georgian princes became enthusiastic Mongol servants, leading armies against other Christian kingdoms. Others tried subtle resistance and were crushed. You might wonder how 20,000 Mongols conquered a kingdom of over 1 million. The answer lies in understanding Mongol military innovation combined with deliberate terrorism. First, the Mongols fought wars of annihilation, not wars of honor. European and Georgian armies followed chivalric codes. Soldiers expected quarter if they surrendered. Nobles expected ransom, not execution. The Mongols rejected all of this. Their policy was simple: submit before we arrive, or everyone dies. This terrorized populations into not resisting. Second, Mongol armies moved faster than anyone thought possible. They traveled with strings of horses. Each warrior had multiple mounts, allowing them to cover distances that would exhaust European cavalry. They could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike and vanish before defenders could organize. This created a psychological climate of helplessness. Third, the Mongols were information warfare experts. They used spies, captured officials and collaborators to map out enemy territories in advance. They knew where grain stores were. They knew which fortresses were strongest. They knew which nobles could be bribed or intimidated. When they invaded, they had already won the intelligence war. Fourth, they were willing to lose battles to win wars. When Georgian armies pursued them after victories, the Mongols would retreat, sometimes for weeks, drawing pursuers deeper into traps. They valued strategic position over tactical glory, But perhaps most importantly, the Mongols were willing to commit atrocities on a scale that paralyzed opposition. When you know that resistance means your entire family will be executed, your city burned, and your name erased from history, surrender becomes the only rational choice. The Mongols understood that extreme violence at the beginning of a campaign could make later conquests bloodless. Georgia would remain under Mongol control for over a century. It wasn't until the Mongol Empire fragmented in the mid-1300s that Georgia regained any real independence, and even then, it was as a collection of weakened principalities, not the unified kingdom it had been. The Mongol invasions fundamentally changed Georgian society. The country's demographic center shifted, its aristocracy was replaced, its military tradition was broken. The confident kingdom that had crushed Muslim armies and spread Christianity throughout the Caucasus was gone forever. Contemporary observers struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could a Christian kingdom, protected by God, defended by mountains, ruled by righteous kings, be so completely destroyed? Georgian religious thinkers wrestled with this for generations. Some concluded it was divine punishment for sins. Others decided the Mongols represented a test of faith. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The Mongols had discovered that medieval warfare was obsolete. Heavy cavalry, stone fortresses, chivalric codes, none of it mattered against an army that moved like lightning, fought without mercy, and turned warfare into systematic extermination. Georgia learned what Persia, Russia, China, and countless other kingdoms learned. When the Mongols came, you had two choices: submit immediately and completely, accepting permanent subjugation, or resist and watch everything you loved be ground into dust. Most kingdoms that chose resistance ceased to exist. Georgia chose resistance. Walk through Georgia today and you'll find ruined fortresses, abandoned cities, churches built on the foundations of older, larger churches that were destroyed in the 13th century. Mass graves that were only discovered centuries later. The Mongol conquest of Georgia was not an outlier. It was typical of how the Mongol Empire expanded. The same pattern played out in Persia, where entire cities were depopulated, in Russia, where principalities were turned into tributary states, in China, where millions died during the campaigns of conquest. But Georgia's tragedy was especially cruel because the kingdom genuinely believed it was protected. Mountains, fortresses, military prowess, and God's favor had shielded it for generations. The Georgians couldn't conceive of an enemy that rendered all of those advantages meaningless. The Mongols taught them otherwise, in blood. The final death toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Conservative estimates suggest at least 100,000 Georgians died directly from Mongol violence between 1220 and 1240. Hundreds of thousands more died from starvation, disease, and social collapse in the following decades. Georgia's population wouldn't recover to pre-Mongol levels for over 2 centuries. This is the story of how 20,000 horsemen destroyed a kingdom of 1 million, how sophisticated military tactics combined with deliberate atrocity became unstoppable, how a Christian civilization that had endured for centuries was systematically dismantled by warriors who understood that in total war, mercy was just another weakness to exploit. The Mongols didn't conquer Georgia because they were more numerous. They conquered it because they were willing to do things Georgian society couldn't imagine doing. They made warfare so terrible that opposition became psychologically impossible. Georgia learned the same lesson that echoed across Eurasia in the 13th century. When you see the Mongol banners on the horizon, you have already lost. The only question is whether you'll lose everything quickly or everything slowly. Most kingdoms chose slowly. Georgia chose slowly, and the Caucasus Mountains became decorated with bones.